We are doing a deep dive today into, well, a number. A number is so massive it pretty much breaks your brain. We are talking about global debt.
That's right. We hear the headlines all the time. The US owes 36 trillion, China owes 18 trillion. But when you add it all up, every government, every company, every household, you get a global bill that's pushing $300 trillion.
$300 trillion. I mean, how do you even visualize that?
It's almost impossible. But think of it this way. If you took that entire amount, all in $1 bills, and just started stacking them,
Okay.
you'd have a stack tall enough to get you to the moon
And back.
and back, 50 times over.
Wow. Okay, so that number is basically meaningless in human terms. It's just huge.
It's staggering. It's about 3 times the size of the entire global economy. And that scale, it brings up this really interesting puzzle we want to unpack for you.
Which is, if every country is borrowing from every other country and every bank is lending to every other bank, who exactly gets the final paycheck? Who is holding the bill?
It sounds like some kind of, elaborate accounting trick.
Right.
But the answer actually reveals the engine of the modern world. So our mission here is to figure out how global debt became this system of constant motion, not stability.
And what happens if that motion, that cycle, ever stops? Okay, so let's dial it way back. Debt feels like this very modern, very complicated problem. But at its core, it's not. It's actually one of the oldest human ideas there is. A simple promise.
Exactly. Before we had money or contracts or anything like that, debt was just trust. Think about it in the simplest terms. I'm a farmer, you're my neighbor. I lend you a bag of grain in the spring so you can plant your fields.
And I promise to pay you back at harvest time, maybe with a little extra grain as a thank you.
Right. You're just borrowing from your future self to fix a problem you have today. It's a social tool.
That works perfectly in a small village. But it doesn't quite scale up when, say, a king needs to fund a war.
No, it does not. And that's where we see the evolution. This happened back in the 1600s. England's King Charles II needed cash for a war with the Dutch.
And I'm guessing the nobles weren't just lining up to give him a personal loan?
They were not. So his government came up with an innovation. They started selling off pieces of the debt to the public. We call them bonds now.
A written, standardized promise of repayment with interest.
Exactly. It was revolutionary. It let the state raise huge sums of money without having to immediately raise taxes, which is, always politically unpopular.
And that practice just grew and grew, especially with the huge costs of rebuilding after the World Wars.
But the real jet fuel for the system we have today came when the rules of money itself changed. For a long time, money was tied to something physical. Usually gold.
Right, a Bretton Woods agreement in 1944 tied the U.S. dollar directly to gold.
But by the late 60s, the global economy was growing so fast and so much money was being borrowed and spent that there just wasn't enough gold in the U.S. vaults to back all the dollars out there.
The system was straining at the seams.
It was. So in 1971, President Nixon, just fine, he broke the link. He took the dollar completely off the gold standard.
And money became what we now call fiat currency.
Which is a fancy way of saying it's not backed by anything physical anymore. It's backed only by the government's decree, its promise, and most importantly, by the trust people have in that government.
And once you remove that physical anchor, the gold, you basically take the brakes off.
Completely. Governments were free to create money and borrow almost at will. And that's what really fueled the debt explosion that started in the 80s.
So debt went from being a tool for emergencies to being the main engine for, well, for everything. Schools, roads, managing recessions. It became the norm.
Okay, so this brings us back to that core puzzle. Who is holding this $300 trillion IOU?
People usually imagine some, I don't know, shadowy banker in a secret room somewhere.
Right, but that's not how it works. Modern debt doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in circles.
It's more like a network that's always in motion. We have a good analogy for this. Think about a stadium wave at a sports game.
Okay.
No single person is the wave, right? The wave is just the pattern that emerges when everybody stands up and sits down in the right sequence. Global debt is like that. It's the pattern created by billions of promises all moving together.
And we can see that circle really clearly if we just look at the U.S., which is the world's most indebted country, $36 trillion.
But here's the shocking part. Who does the U.S. owe most of that money to?
The answer is Americans. About 70% of U.S. debt is owed to itself.
Which means you, the listener, are probably a lender. Indirectly, anyway.
That's right. When you put your money in a bank, the bank doesn't just let it sit there. It has to put that money to work.
And one of the safest things they can do is buy U.S. Treasury bonds. They're seen as basically zero risk.
And it's not just banks, it's your pension fund. About a quarter of its money is likely in bonds. It's insurance companies. They put over 60% of their money in bonds.
So all our idle savings, our retirement money, it's all being looped back around to become loan money for the government.
Yes, and this is where that circular motion becomes so important. The government pays interest on those bonds back to the banks and the pension funds
Which gives them more cash.
to buy more bonds. It's a self-reinforcing loop. And it's not just a nice feature of the system. Those bonds act as the safest form of collateral on Earth. The whole global financial system is built on top of them.
And this loop isn't just happening inside the U.S.
Not at all. That same logic explains the 30% of U.S. debt held by other countries. Foreign governments and banks buy U.S. bonds for the exact same reason. They're a safe place to park their extra cash.
So Japanese savings might end up loaning money to the Dutch, who loan to Brazilians.
And the Brazilian central bank turns around and buys U.S. bonds with its spare cash. It's a truly global web.
So then how does the government ever pay the original loan back?
Well, that's the trick. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
For the most part, no. When old bonds come due, the government just issues new bonds to get the cash to pay off the old ones. It's called rolling over the debt.
So national debt isn't like my mortgage, which I'm trying to pay off and get rid of.
Exactly. It's more like a permanent utility, like the water pipes in a city. You don't try to eliminate the pipes, you just manage them and keep them working. The goal isn't repayment. The goal is to keep refinancing at a good interest rate. Forever. So if that engine has to keep running forever, it leads to a pretty uncomfortable truth.
Which is that governments can't really stop borrowing, not without causing huge problems.
Right. It's become too fundamental. When a government borrows and spends money, say on a new highway, that money goes directly into the economy. Businesses get contracts, workers get paid, they spend their money.
It fuels growth.
It does. In a country like the U.S., sometimes 1 out of every $4 the government spends is borrowed. If you suddenly turn off that tap,
The spending stops, the money stops circulating, and you get a recession.
we saw exactly what happens when the engine stops. Look at Greece, starting around 2008.
Right. Investors got scared and just stopped buying their bonds.
Their trust broke. And suddenly, Greece couldn't borrow anymore. They ran out of money and were forced into what's called austerity, just massive cuts to public spending.
And the result was brutal.
Their whole economy shrank by 25%. 1 in 4 public sector workers lost their job. It was a catastrophe.
Which proves you actually need to borrow, especially in a crisis. Like during the COVID pandemic in 2020, people stopped spending. So the U.S. government had to step in and fill that gap.
They borrowed $3.8 trillion in that 1 year alone.
Wow. So we can't stop borrowing, but the pile just keeps getting bigger.
And that leads us to our first real knowledge gap for you to think about. If just stopping the borrowing causes a massive depression, like in Greece, then what specific politically realistic options do wealthy countries actually have to gradually lower their debt without just crashing their own economies?
That's a huge question. And we should also be clear that not all debt is the same.
No, at all.
Yeah.
A country like Germany can borrow very cheaply because everyone trusts they'll pay it back. Their bonds are safe.
But for developing nations, say Sri Lanka or Pakistan, it's a different story.
They face much higher borrowing costs because there's more perceived risk. And that can create a horrible debt trap where they have to keep borrowing more money just to pay the interest on their old loans.
And when a government gets squeezed like that, they're often tempted to use the last resort.
The printing press. Just create more money out of thin air to pay the bills.
And that's where the danger of fiat currency really comes home to roost.
It is, because when you print tons of new money, the value of all the existing money goes down. That's inflation. Prices go up, your savings are worth less.
In an extreme case like Venezuela a few years back, the government printed so much money that prices were doubling every few weeks. A loaf of bread could cost millions. It just destroys the economy. So as this giant pile of debt keeps growing, it creates another problem. The interest payments themselves start to eat up the national budget.
A huge chunk of it, yeah. That's money that can't be used for new schools or hospitals or fixing roads. It's just servicing old debt.
The whole system keeps working as long as two things are true. Refinancing is cheap, and lenders stay confident.
But that trust, that confidence, can be fragile.
Yeah.
especially for developing countries.
Oh, them in particular.
Because they often have to borrow in a foreign currency, usually US dollars, just to get lenders to trust them.
Okay, so what's the risk there?
The risk is that if their own local currency suddenly gets weaker against the dollar, the real cost of paying back that dollar-denominated debt can just explode overnight.
And then lenders get nervous and demand even higher interest rates, and the whole thing spirals.
And the absolute worst-case scenario, the ultimate failure, is a default.
That's when a country just says, we can't pay, we're done.
Exactly. It's the sovereign equivalent of missing your mortgage payment. And once you default, your credibility is shot. It becomes incredibly difficult to borrow your way out of the crisis you just created.
So when people see this fragility in the system, this dependency on debt and trust, they start looking for alternatives.
They start looking for assets that don't rely on a government's promise to pay. They want something tangible, a non-liability asset.
And we are seeing that happen in a big way right now in 2025. Record amounts of money are pouring into hard assets.
Things like gold and silver. Gold is up almost 28% this year alone. Silver just hit a 30-year high.
This shift away from government promises is a really powerful signal. You even see strange things happening in the markets. For example, there are companies like Gold Mining Incorporated. The price of actual physical gold is skyrocketing. But the stock price for a company like that, which owns massive proven gold resources in the ground, hasn't quite caught up yet.
It shows that investors are starting to prioritize owning the actual resource over just a financial claim. They see physical assets as a safer bet than the purely financial system.
And the big banks are noticing. JP Morgan is now forecasting that gold could hit $4,000 an ounce by the middle of 2026.
That's a huge move. It shows that the global markets are pricing in the growing risk in this whole interconnected web of debt.
Okay, so to try and wrap this enormous deep dive up, global debt isn't one big bill that someone has to pay.
No, it's a web, a vast network of promises. It acts as the saving system for investors and the funding system for governments all at once. It's built on motion, on perpetual refinancing.
So as you process all of this, we want to leave you with two final critical knowledge gaps to think about.
First, we've talked about how risky it is for developing nations to borrow in foreign currencies. So the question is, which specific institutions like the IMF or the World Bank play the biggest role in preventing or managing these kinds of crises, and what tools do they actually have?
And the second one is even bigger. If the entire global financial system uses high-quality government bonds as its ultimate safe collateral, what would replace them? What assets could possibly take their place if a major power like the US or Europe ever lost the trust of global investors?
The whole world is basically running on the idea that the total amount of debt should never actually shrink. It should just be managed and rolled over forever.
So the real danger isn't the size of the number, as mind-boggling as it is.
No, the real danger is a crisis of confidence. The risk is that trust breaks, and the whole machine loses that forward motion it needs to survive. That's the tightrope the entire global economy is walking on right now.